3, 2. The photographer never reached one. Camille Sutton Hargrove had a pair of ceremonial scissors raised in front of 64 families when Owen Talbot, the licensed surveyor I had hired, stepped beside the new Marina gangway and said, "Do not cut that ribbon yet." Behind Camille, people were holding Marina folders and keys to slips they had paid more than $20,000 apiece to use, and several of their new boats were already rocking beyond the floating docks on Blue Heron Lake. Then everybody went quiet. Camille lowered the scissors and stared at Owen like he had walked into the wrong event. "This is Cedar Glass HOA access," she said. "You have no authority to stop our opening." I was standing about 20 feet away with my attorney, Naomi Whitaker, and instead of arguing, I handed Owen the survey exhibit we had spent weeks preparing. He checked the boundary monument, checked his measurement again, and pointed toward the place where the gangway touched shore. "Ma'am, that landing is nearly 38 feet inside Mr. Boone's parcel." Camille laughed once. It did not sound confident. She pulled an old developer map from her folder, spread it open, and tapped a dotted line running toward the lake. "There, community lake access. It has been part of Cedar Glass from the beginning." Owen leaned over the page and pointed to 3 words printed beside that line. "Proposed community lake access." Then he asked the question I had been waiting months to hear. "Where is the executed easement?" Camille looked at her attorney. He did not answer. That was the first moment the 64 buyers stopped looking at me like I was the man ruining their marina opening and started looking at Camille like she might have something to explain. Peter Mercer was near the front holding the packet for slip 41, the slip he and his wife had paid $26,000 for. He had no idea yet why Naomi had a copy of the language he had relied on when he paid. Camille tried again. "The lake is for everyone, Wesley." I looked at the gangway, then at the families behind her. "You did not sell them the lake. You sold them away across my land." And Cedar Glass had never shown me the document giving them that way. Let me back up. My name is Wesley Hart Boone. I am 58 years old, a retired title researcher, and I own Boone Landing, 18 acres along Blue Heron Lake with more than 1,100 feet of shoreline that has been in my family since my father, Harold Boone, bought it in the early 1970s. A few months before that ribbon cutting, Camille came to me with what she called a shared shoreline vision. Cedar Glass Preserve had around 240 homes west of my property, plenty of beautiful lake views, and one expensive problem. The neighborhood had almost no lawful access to the water. Camille wanted to buy a narrow strip across Boone Landing so the HOA could connect a private marina to shore. I said no. That should have ended the conversation, but Camille opened the same old developer map she would later wave around on opening day and pointed to that dotted corridor. She told me the original developer had always intended it to be community access. I asked, who granted the easement? She talked about planning history, community benefit, and property values, but she never gave me a recording number or a signed document. That bothered me. A few weeks later, a glossy Cedar Glass brochure showed up announcing 64 guaranteed dock rights, with memberships running from more than $20,000 to nearly $30,000 and guaranteed pedestrian shoreline access included in the promise. They were selling access before they had shown me any right to cross my property. If somebody was already taking $20,000 or $30,000 from families for access across your land, would you confront them right there, or keep quiet until you had every document in your hands? I already knew which one I was going to do. I printed the brochure, walked into the small office off my kitchen, and pulled down the metal document box my father had kept for decades. Inside were deeds, shoreline surveys, dock permits, boundary descriptions, tax records, and old correspondence arranged in Harold's block handwriting. Dad used to tell me that a line on a brochure showed what somebody wanted, while a recorded document showed what they actually had. That night, with Cedar Glass promising 64 families a path to the lake, I started checking which one Camille had. Dad bought Boone Landing in 1972, back when Blue Heron Lake was mostly fishing cabins, gravel drives, and families who knew each other by the trucks parked outside the hardware store. His name was Harold Boone, and he paid for the 18 acres over years of careful work, then treated every survey marker and property record like it mattered because, to him, it did. By the time I inherited the place, the parcel included more than 1,100 feet of shoreline, a weathered wooden dock, and enough family history that putting a price on it never made much sense to me. It was home. Elaine understood that better than anyone. and during the last years of our marriage, she would carry her coffee to the end of the dock on summer mornings before the heat settled over the lake. She had one old ceramic mug she liked, cream-colored with a little blue heron painted on the side, and she would sit there watching the mist lift while I checked the boat or worked around the property. After she died, I kept that mug in the kitchen cabinet exactly where she had left it, even though I could never bring myself to drink from it. Something stayed put. The dock stayed too, although I replaced boards when they softened and kept the permits current whenever the county required paperwork. I was not trying to preserve Boone Landing like a museum, and I was not one of those landowners who thought every newcomer was a threat. I simply believed that if something belonged to you, you maintained it, paid the taxes, kept the records, and respected the same rights when you crossed onto somebody else's property. Dad taught me that. He also gave me the habit that later became my career, because while other kids thought a property map was boring, I liked figuring out why one boundary followed an old stone wall while another stopped at a survey pin buried beside a creek. I eventually spent years working as a title researcher, tracing deeds, easements, liens, old plats, and transfers for people who usually did not care how complicated ownership could become until something went wrong. Most problems started with assumptions. That was why Camille's concept map bothered me long after she drove away from our first meeting, because I knew the word proposed was not decoration. It meant somebody had considered something, drawn something, maybe even planned something, but it did not tell me that Harold Boone had ever signed away a legal right. So I went to his metal document box. Dad had kept it on a shelf in the small office off the kitchen, and opening it still brought back the faint smell of paper, machine oil, and the cedar blocks he used to keep insects away. Inside were folders labeled by year in his blocky handwriting, with the original deed stored separately from Shoreline surveys, dock permits, tax records, boundary descriptions, and correspondence from developers who had approached him over the decades. Dad kept everything. I spent that evening at the dining table, reading through the records slowly instead of searching only for something that proved me right. That matters, because when you are angry about property, it is easy to look for evidence that supports what you already believe and ignore anything that does not. I wanted the truth first. The deed matched what I knew. The old surveys showed the Boone shoreline, and the permits confirmed that our dock had been maintained under our family's control for years. I found no recorded grant giving cedar glass pedestrian access across the parcel, but absence in my own box was not enough for me to declare victory. Records can exist elsewhere. The next morning, I started making a list of what needed to be checked through the county records, including the chain of title, subdivision plats, recorded easements, and anything tied to the developer that created Cedar Glass Preserve. I was halfway through that list when my phone rang. Camille sounded friendly, almost cheerful, and told me she hoped I had reconsidered because the Marina project was moving forward and the board wanted to avoid unnecessary friction. I asked her for the recording information for the access easement. Silence. Then she said, "Wesley, you are getting hung up on technicalities. Everyone knows that corridor was intended for lake access." I looked through the kitchen window toward the dock where Elaine used to sit and said, "Intended is not the same as granted, Camille." Her voice cooled immediately. "Our attorneys are comfortable with our position." I told her that was fine and asked her attorneys to send me the document. She ended the call. 3 days later, Cedar Glass residents began posting pictures of Marina reservation packets, and one neighbor forwarded me a sales sheet promising guaranteed pedestrian shoreline access with each dock membership. The prices were real money, more than $20,000 for some slips and closer to $30,000 for others, and the language did not say proposed, planned, expected, or subject to securing an easement. It said guaranteed. That changed everything. Camille was no longer asking me to sell a strip of land, because she was selling people something that appeared to depend on crossing that strip whether I agreed or not. I printed the brochure, placed it beside Dad's deed, and stared at the two pieces of paper for a long time. One was marketing, the other was ownership, and I knew which one I trusted. The first sign that Camille had stopped treating my answer as a real answer came on a Tuesday morning, when a flatbed truck rolled into the public boat launch across the lake carrying sections of brand-new floating dock. By noon, a work barge was moving those sections west towards Cedar Glass Preserve, and residents were standing along the shore taking pictures like they were watching their neighborhood finally become the lake community Camille had promised. I stayed on my dock, watched through a pair of binoculars for a few minutes, then wrote the date and time in a notebook before going back inside. No argument. 2 days later, I sent Cedar Glass a formal cease and desist through certified mail stating 3 simple facts. Boone Landing was private property. I had granted no pedestrian access across it, and nobody had permission to place a gangway or other marina structure on my shoreline. I attached the parcel description and asked the association to provide the recorded instrument supporting any claim of access, because if they truly had an easement, producing it should have been easy. Their attorney answered the following week with a polished letter referring to what he called historic recreational access benefiting the Cedar Glass community. Still no document. That told me plenty. I called the attorney and asked for the recording number, and after a short pause he said their position was based on development history, prior planning materials, and long-standing expectations connected to the lake. I told him I was not asking what people expected, because expectations do not tell a title researcher who has the right to cross a parcel. Just send me the recorded easement, I said. He never did. Meanwhile, Camille kept selling memberships, and every few days another Cedar Glass resident posted a picture of a slip assignment, a marina welcome packet, or a new boat they planned to keep there once the docks opened. The project was becoming real to them. That was the part that bothered me most, because these were not 64 people sitting in a boardroom plotting how to take my shoreline. Most were ordinary homeowners who had been shown professional brochures, contracts, renderings, and a marina plan carrying the confidence of an organization they already paid dues to every month. They believed what they were sold. Then the construction moved closer to Boone Landing, and I began seeing how Camille intended to solve the one problem she could not market away. The floating sections could be assembled from the water, so the crews did not need to drive across my land. But a marina full of docks still needed a lawful way for people to reach it from shore. One morning, a barge brought in a metal gangway and positioned it near a narrow shelf along my western shoreline, close to the Cedar Glass side of the property. I grabbed my camera. I photographed the gangway from several places on Boone Landing, included fixed landmarks in the frames, saved the original files with their dates, and made notes about where the crew had placed the shore end. I did not touch it. Camille arrived later that afternoon in a dark sport utility vehicle and walked toward the shoreline with 2 board members while I stood near my dock. "Wesley," she called, "I hope we are not going to have another problem over this." I walked over and asked whether she was claiming the gangway was outside Boone Landing. She gave me a patient little smile and said, "I am saying this is the community access point shown on the original development plan. Same map." I asked again for the easement, and she sighed as though I were refusing to understand something obvious. You cannot block an entire community from the lake because you dislike how the paperwork was done 50 years ago. I looked at the gangway, then back at her. I am not blocking a right, Camille. I am asking you to prove one exists. Her smile disappeared. She told me the marina would open as scheduled, the memberships were valid, and Cedar Glass had legal counsel handling the rest. Then she walked away. I let her. Over the next few weeks, the docks filled out across the water, electrical pedestals appeared along the slips, reservation numbers went up, and the association began promoting an opening celebration with photographers and a ribbon cutting. From a distance, it looked finished. That was dangerous, because finished things feel legitimate even when the paperwork underneath them is not. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, a gray sport utility vehicle came slowly down my gravel drive and stopped near the house, and a couple about my age stepped out holding a Cedar Glass marina folder. The man introduced himself as Peter Mercer, his wife as Allison, and both of them looked embarrassed to be bothering me. "Mr. Boone," Peter said, "they told us this was where we would reach the marina." I asked which slip they had. 41, Allison said. Peter opened the folder and showed me their agreement, then pointed to the amount they had paid. $26,000. I felt my stomach tighten. They had already put money down on a boat, and Allison told me they had chosen the membership because their grandchildren loved the lake and the contract promised easy walking access from Cedar Glass to the docks. I asked if I could read the access language. Peter handed me the agreement, and there it was in plain English. Guaranteed pedestrian shoreline access. Guaranteed. I gave the papers back and told them to keep every contract, receipt, brochure, email, and message they had received about the marina, and not to sign anything new until they understood exactly what they had purchased. Peter looked toward the gangway and asked, "Are you saying we cannot get to our slip?" I chose my words carefully. I am saying nobody has shown me a recorded right allowing 64 members to cross my property to get there. Allison went quiet. That was the moment this stopped being just my property dispute, because Camille had collected real money from real families who had made real plans around a promise I had never agreed to honor. I went inside after they left, put my father's documents beside the Mercer agreement notes, and called Naomi Claire Whitaker, a property attorney whose name I knew from my title research years. She listened without interrupting while I explained the concept map, the missing easement, the gangway, and the 64 memberships. Then she asked one question. "Have you pulled the complete chain of title yet?" I said no. "Good," she replied. "Then we do not start with Camille's story, and we do not start with yours." She paused. "We start with the records." Naomi's office sat above a small bank building about 20 minutes from Blue Heron Lake, and the first thing she did was spread my documents across a conference table instead of telling me what she thought had happened. She separated everything into 3 groups: what my family owned, what Cedar Glass claimed, and what still needed to be proven through public records. Then she looked at me and said, "If we cannot prove it on paper, we do not say it." Fair enough. Naomi was in her early 50s, calm, precise, and completely unimpressed by the kind of official-looking language that scares people into giving up before they understand their rights. She read the Marina brochure twice, circled the words "Guaranteed Pedestrian Shoreline Access," then placed it beside the letter from the association attorney claiming historic recreational access. The 2 phrases sounded powerful, but neither one told us where that supposed right had been legally created. Words are not rights. The next morning, Naomi and I began working backward through the land records, starting with my current deed and tracing Boone Landing through every recorded transfer we could locate. Years of title research came back to me quickly, but I forced myself to slow down because one missed reference could change everything, especially around older lake property where descriptions were sometimes written before modern surveys. Naomi checked the legal side while I built a simple timeline showing who owned each parcel and when Cedar Glass entered the picture. Then we found the old subdivision file. Cedar Glass Preserve had been planned years after my father bought Boone Landing, and the developer's early documents showed exactly why Camille had been so confident about that dotted line. One planning sheet showed a narrow connection toward the lake labeled Proposed Community Lake Access, and another sketch showed a 24-foot corridor crossing part of Boone Landing toward the shoreline. For about 10 seconds, I wondered whether Camille had found something I had missed. Then Naomi turned the page. Behind the concept map was a draft easement prepared for the original developer, along with a survey sketch and an offer letter asking Harold Boone to grant pedestrian and marina access across that 24-foot strip. The paperwork was detailed enough to look serious, with space for signatures, property descriptions, and recording information. But the signature lines were empty. Nothing had been granted. We kept searching because an unsigned draft alone did not prove the negotiations had ended, and I did not want to make the same mistake Camille was making by treating one document as the whole story. A later folder contained correspondence between the developer and my father, including a short letter typed on Harold's old stationery and signed in the same heavy handwriting I knew from the labels on his metal box. Naomi read it aloud. No lake access granted. Family shoreline. That was Dad. The developer had offered money, Harold had refused, and we found. No later executed agreement. No recorded easement, and no document showing that Cedar Glass ever acquired the corridor it wanted. Naomi leaned back and said, "Now we have a much clearer picture, but I still want a licensed surveyor on the ground." She was right. A deed can describe a boundary, and an old plat can show what somebody proposed, but neither of us was going to stand beside a new gangway and pretend we could establish its exact location by eyeballing the shoreline. Naomi recommended Owen Pierce Talbot, a licensed surveyor who had worked on lakefront boundaries for years and had no connection to Cedar Glass or my family. Independence mattered. Owen arrived at Boone Landing 2 mornings later with field equipment, copies of the recorded descriptions, and none of the confidence Camille had shown when she pointed at her brochure. He spent hours locating evidence, checking monuments, comparing measurements, and working from the records instead of asking me where I believed the line should be. I stayed out of his way. Late that afternoon, Owen asked me to walk down toward the new gangway with him. and he stopped well before the point where Cedar Glass had been treating the shoreline like its own entrance. He checked his measurements again, looked toward the metal structure, and said, "Wesley, they are not a couple of feet over." My stomach tightened. "How far?" He showed me his field notes and explained that the shore end of the gangway appeared to sit nearly 38 feet inside the Boone parcel based on the boundary evidence he had located. That was not a fuzzy line. I called Naomi from the dock, and she told me not to touch the gangway, not to confront the workers, and not to post anything online until Owen completed his survey work and she reviewed the permit file. "We know where it appears to be," she said. "Now I want to know what they told the county it was." That question opened the next door. The Marina permit materials described the landing point as an existing HOA shoreline corridor, language much stronger than the word proposed on the old development map. Somebody had taken a plan for a right the developer once wanted and presented the access point as though that right already existed. That was serious. Naomi immediately prepared preservation letters directing Cedar Glass and the people involved with the Marina project to retain board emails, consultant reports, membership contracts, permit communications, and sales materials connected to the access claim. I asked whether we should warn Peter and Allison Mercer about what we had found, along with the other slip holders if we could identify them. Naomi thought for a moment and said, "Tell the Mercers only what we can prove today, and tell them to protect their records. We are not starting a neighborhood rumor mill. Clean evidence first." I called Peter that evening and explained that a licensed surveyor had found a serious boundary problem with the gangway and that our record search had not found an executed easement across Boone Landing. He was quiet for several seconds before asking the question I had been dreading. "Then what exactly did we pay $26,000 for?" I did not have an answer for him yet, but somebody at Cedar Glass did. Peter's question stayed with me after the call because $26,000 was not a misunderstanding you fixed with an apology at the next board meeting. Naomi reminded me that the Mercers were only one family, and if Cedar Glass had sold most of the 64 memberships at similar prices, the association had taken in a serious amount of money based on access it still had not proven. That meant we needed to stop thinking like angry neighbors and start thinking like people building a clean record. Every document mattered. Owen finished his field work and prepared a survey exhibit showing the Boone Landing boundary, the shoreline, the old proposed corridor, and the location of the new gangway. His measurements placed the shore in nearly 38 feet inside my parcel, far enough that nobody could reasonably explain it as a survey pin being off by a few inches. He also warned me not to confuse his job with Naomi's, because he could show where the boundary and improvements were located, but he was not there to decide what legal rights Cedar Glass might claim. That distinction mattered. Naomi spent the next several days comparing Owen's work with the old developer file, and the story became simpler every time we removed Camille's sales language from it. The original developer wanted a 24-foot route across Boone Landing, prepared a draft easement, sent my father an offer, and received a written refusal. We found no later signed grant, no transfer, no recorded easement. The dotted line had never grown up. What bothered Naomi even more was the permit language calling the landing point an existing HOA shoreline corridor, because the historical documents we had found did not describe an existing right at all. They showed an attempted negotiation that ended with Harold saying no. Naomi told me not to jump from bad paperwork to accusing anyone of fraud, because intent is something you prove with evidence, not something you guess because you are angry. So we waited for the records. That was harder than it sounds. Cedar Glass kept sending cheerful Marina updates to residents. Contractors kept finishing small details along the docks, and Camille announced that the grand opening would include refreshments, photographs, and the formal distribution of Marina access materials. From my porch, I could see the floating slips sitting on the water like the argument had already been settled. It had not. The first batch of preserved correspondence reached Naomi late on a Thursday, and she called me before dinner with the kind of voice lawyers use when they want you to listen before you react. I drove to her office, sat across from her conference table, and watched her place 3 printed emails in front of me. "Read them in order," she said. The first came from counsel working with the association during the Marina planning process, and the language was careful but clear. They had not located recorded upland access supporting the proposed pedestrian route and recommended resolving the Boone issue before representing access as guaranteed. The second came from a Marina consultant who described the slips, without boon access, as waterborne improvements without a lawful pedestrian connection from cedar glass. Both warnings came before the memberships were fully sold. Then came Camille's email. She wrote that once enough memberships were committed, Wesley Boone would no longer be dealing only with the board because dozens of homeowners would expect access and would pressure him to reach an agreement. I read that sentence twice. Naomi did not need to explain it. Camille had understood that access was unresolved, and instead of solving that problem before taking people's money, she appeared to believe the buyers themselves could become leverage against me afterward. That changed how I saw everything. Peter and Allison were not standing between Camille and me by accident, and neither were the other families who had bought boats, moved savings, or planned summers around those slips. Their expectations were part of the strategy. I felt angry, but not in the way Camille probably expected. I did not want 64 frightened families showing up at Boone Landing believing I had personally taken something away from them, and I did not want to release half a stack of documents online and turn the neighborhood into 2 shouting camps before the facts were organized. Naomi agreed. If this becomes a popularity contest, everybody loses, she said. If it stays about documents, the documents can answer for themselves. So we made the record cleaner. Naomi organized the deed chain, Harold's refusal letter, the unsigned draft easement, the permit materials, the membership language, my cease and desist, counsel's warning, the consultant's warning, and Camille's email into a timeline that anyone could follow without knowing property law. Owen prepared a final exhibit that showed the physical problem in one glance. I kept quiet. A few days later, a glossy invitation arrived for the Marina grand opening, complete with the cedar glass logo, a ribbon-cutting time, and a line welcoming all 64 reserved slip members to celebrate their new lake access. Camille was still moving forward. Naomi requested that the appropriate compliance office review the access materials, and Owen agreed to be available to explain his survey findings if needed. Nobody promised me some dramatic shutdown, and I did not know exactly what would happen that morning. Real disputes do not come with movie endings scheduled in advance. But Camille had chosen a public opening before the access question was settled, and now the people who had paid for those slips would be standing in the same place as the documents that explained what they had actually bought. The night before the ceremony, I went into Dad's old office and opened his metal box one more time. I took out the original deed, his Shoreline records, and the letter with the sentence I had heard in his voice every time I read it. No lake access granted. Family Shoreline. Then I closed the lid. Camille had a ribbon, 64 customers, and a finished marina. We had the paper trail. The morning of the marina opening, I woke before sunrise and made coffee while Blue Heron Lake sat gray and still beyond the kitchen windows. Dad's metal document box was on the dining table, but Naomi had already made certified copies of everything we planned to rely on, so the originals were staying safely at Boone Landing. I wore a light blue Oxford shirt, stone chinos, and clean leather boots because I was not going to a fight. I was going to watch a property question get answered. Keep it simple. Naomi arrived just after 7 with 2 document cases, and Owen pulled in behind her with his survey equipment, and the final exhibit rolled inside a protective tube. Before we left the house, Naomi reviewed the order one more time. Deed and chain of title first, old development records second, survey evidence third, sales and permit language after that. She did not want anyone jumping straight to Camille's emails before the basic property facts were clear. Facts first. We walked toward the western shoreline, while Cedar Glass staff finished setting up folding tables, coffee, pastries, and small white envelopes containing marina materials for the slip holders. A large sign welcomed the 64 members, and several new boat owners were already pointing toward their assigned slips, while a photographer moved people into position near the ribbon. From 20 yards away, it looked like a successful project ready for its first summer weekend. That was the illusion. Owen went directly to work rather than joining the crowd, checking the monument he had previously located and confirming his measurements against the final survey exhibit. He explained again that his role was narrow. He could identify the boundary evidence and show where the gangway sat in relation to that boundary, but he was not there to decide every legal question about lake use. Naomi nodded because that separation made the evidence stronger, not weaker. Everybody had a lane. Around 8:30, Peter and Allison Mercer arrived and spotted me near the shoreline. Peter looked tired, and Allison held the same Marina folder she had brought to my house, now stuffed with receipts, emails, and a copy of their $26,000 agreement. "We kept everything like you said," she told me quietly. "Smart move." I told them I still could not promise what the association would do about their money, but the records would at least let them understand the problem before anyone asked them to sign something new. Peter looked toward Camille, who was greeting residents beside the ribbon as though nothing unusual was happening, then asked whether she had known about the missing easement before they paid. I told him Naomi had correspondence that addressed that question, but I wanted the documents presented in order instead of giving him my interpretation in a parking lot conversation. He understood. That was important to me because I had spent enough years in title work to know how quickly people confuse three separate things: what a map shows, what a survey locates, and what a recorded document actually grants. A surveyor can measure and show where improvements sit, but the survey itself does not magically create ownership or an easement. A concept plan can show what a developer hoped to build, but hope is not a property right either. Paper has jobs. By 9, nearly every reserved slip household had someone present, and the mood around the marina was cheerful enough that I almost felt sorry for what was coming. Camille wore a cream blazer over a lake blue blouse and moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone hosting a resort opening, stopping for photographs, and thanking residents for believing in her vision. When she noticed Naomi, Owen, and me standing together, she walked over without losing her smile. "Here we go, Wesley," she said. "I hope you are not planning to disrupt this for everyone." I told her I was there because the access question had never been resolved, and because the new gangway appeared to cross Boone Landing without permission. Camille glanced toward Owen's equipment and said her attorneys had already reviewed the project. Same answer. Naomi stepped in calmly and asked whether Cedar Glass had located a recorded easement since our last correspondence. Camille said the association had historic rights and original development plans supporting community access, then added that 64 families had purchased memberships in good faith. I looked past her at Peter and Allison. "That is exactly why this needs to be clear," I said. Camille's expression tightened. A few minutes later, a county and lake compliance representative arrived after reviewing the materials Naomi had submitted, introduced herself to the parties, and explained that she was there to understand the access representation and the location of the gangway before the marina began member operations. She did not announce a verdict, threaten anyone, or act like a television judge. She asked for documents. That made Camille nervous. Owen unrolled his exhibit on a folding table and began with the recorded boundary description, the monuments he had located, and the measurements connecting those points to the gangway. Naomi placed the old concept map beside it, followed by the draft 24-foot easement and Harold Boone's written refusal. The contrast was almost painfully simple. One document showed what the developer wanted. Another showed Dad said no. Then Naomi placed the permit materials on the table and pointed to the phrase, "Existing HOA Shoreline Corridor," while Owen indicated the same location on his survey exhibit nearly 38 feet inside Boone Landing. The compliance representative looked from one page to the next and asked Camille who had supplied the description of that corridor as existing. Camille started to answer, stopped, and looked toward the association attorney. For the first time that morning, nobody was looking at me like I was the obstacle. They were looking at the paperwork. The association attorney stepped closer to the folding table and read the permit language without saying anything for several seconds, while Camille stood beside him with one hand resting on the back of a chair. The compliance representative asked again who had described the access point as an existing HOA shoreline corridor, and this time the attorney said he would need to review the full submission history before answering. Camille tried to move the conversation back toward the old development map, but Naomi gently slid the draft easement beside it. The paper trail was tightening. Naomi explained that the original developer had clearly considered creating a 24-foot access route, which was why the dotted corridor appeared on the planning documents in the first place. She then showed the unsigned easement, the offer letter sent to Harold Boone, and my father's written refusal, followed by the absence of any later recorded instrument in the chain we had reviewed. Owen stayed out of the legal argument and pointed only to what his survey work established about the physical location of the gangway. Clean and simple, Camille finally said, You are treating paperwork from 50 years ago like it matters more than 64 families standing here today. I could hear people shifting behind us, and I knew exactly why that argument sounded tempting. Because real families had paid real money and nobody wanted to tell them their summer plans might have been built on a mistake. But that was also why the paperwork mattered so much. People had trusted it. Naomi opened the second document case and told the compliance representative there was another issue she believed the slip holders deserved to understand before the marina began operating. She started with the warning from Association Council, dated before the memberships were fully sold, stating that recorded upland access had not been located and recommending that guaranteed access not be represented until the Boone issue was resolved. Peter moved closer. Next came the Marina consultant's message explaining that without lawful access through Boone Landing, the slips would be waterborne improvements without a lawful pedestrian connection from Cedar Glass. Allison covered her mouth with one hand and looked at Peter. They had been warned. Camille said consultants raise possible problems on every large project and that the board believed those issues could be resolved before opening day. Naomi did not argue with her because the next email did not need much interpretation. She placed it on the table. It was Camille's message about what would happen after enough memberships were sold, and the wording was almost exactly as I remembered it from Naomi's office. Once the buyers were committed, Wesley Boone would face dozens of homeowners expecting access instead of one association board asking for it. The crowd changed. There was no shouting at first, just the strange quiet you get when a room full of people realizes the same thing at nearly the same moment. Peter read the email over Naomi's shoulder, then turned toward Camille and asked, "Were we supposed to pressure him for you?" Camille immediately said that was not what the message meant. Nobody looked convinced. She explained that she had been discussing practical negotiating leverage, not trying to mislead residents, and she reminded everyone that the marina itself existed and the association had invested heavily in making it happen. Peter held up his membership folder. "You guaranteed access before you had access." That landed hard. Allison asked whether Camille knew about the Boone dispute when their $26,000 payment was accepted, and Camille said the board had believed it had a valid historical claim. Naomi quietly pointed out that the issue before them was not whether Camille believed Cedar Glass deserved access, but what rights had actually been established and what buyers had been told before paying. Belief was not the missing document. The compliance representative asked to see my cease and desist next, and Naomi handed over the certified delivery record showing Cedar Glass had received written notice that I disputed any pedestrian access across Boone Landing before the opening. She compared that date with later membership materials still using the word guaranteed, then asked the association attorney whether operations could begin while the access representation and gangway location remained unresolved. He did not give Camille the answer she wanted. He said the association should not begin member access through the disputed corridor until the matter was reviewed and a lawful connection was established. That was the first real shift. Camille looked toward the ribbon, then toward the boats waiting beyond the docks, and for a moment I saw the whole plan from her side. The marina was finished, the customers were present, the photographs were scheduled, and she had expected all of that momentum to make one landowner finally give in. Instead, every extra person she had brought to the shoreline was now hearing the same evidence. Her leverage had become an audience. The compliance representative asked Owen to walk her through the boundary measurement one more time. So he returned to the monument and explained how the recorded description tied to the field evidence he had located. He did not say Cedar Glass could never have a marina, and he did not claim the lake belonged to me. He said only that the gangway, as installed, reached land nearly 38 feet inside the Boone parcel. Precision beat drama. Camille followed us toward the shoreline and said, "The lake is for everyone." Wesley. I looked at her and shook my head. This was never about owning the water. I pointed down at the ground beneath our feet. It is about how your customers get to it. Behind her, Peter was reading the sales agreement again, and other slip holders had started pulling out their own folders and phones. The ribbon was still stretched across the entrance, but nobody was posing for pictures anymore. Then the compliance representative turned to Camille and said the marina could not open for member access under the arrangement presented that morning. The scissors never moved. The ribbon stayed exactly where it was, stretched between two polished posts while 64 families stood behind it holding keys. to slips they could not lawfully reach through the route they had been promised. Camille tried to recover by saying the compliance representative was reacting to an incomplete picture, so Naomi asked for 5 minutes to put the entire record in order on the folding table. Nobody objected. Now the documents got their turn. Naomi started with the recorded boon deed and traced the chain of title forward, showing that the 18-acre parcel and its shoreline remained with my family through every transfer that mattered. Owen placed his final survey beside it and identified the boundary monuments he had found in the field, then showed the measured position of the gangway nearly 38 feet inside Boone Landing. Camille studied the pages without speaking. The land had not moved. Naomi next placed the old cedar glass concept map on the table, and Camille immediately pointed to the dotted corridor as proof that community access had always been part of the development. Owen leaned over the map and tapped the exact wording printed beside the line. Proposed community lake access. Then Naomi set down the 24-foot draft easement that had been prepared for the original developer. No signature. She followed it with the developer's offer letter asking Harold Boone to grant that access, then my father's written response refusing it, and finally the land record search showing no later executed and recorded easement in the materials we had traced. The sequence was simple enough for anyone standing there to understand. They asked. Dad said no. Camille said the developer's intent still mattered because the neighborhood had been designed around eventual lake access. But Naomi answered that intent did not fill in a missing signature or create a recorded property right by itself. The compliance representative asked the association attorney whether he had any executed easement, recorded instrument number, or other document establishing the corridor Camille was relying on. He opened his file, checked several pages, and said, "Not one that I can produce here." That changed the room. Naomi moved to the Marina permit materials and showed where the access point had been, described as an existing HOA shoreline corridor, even though the historical file showed a proposed corridor followed by an unsuccessful attempt to acquire an easement. The compliance representative compared the permit description with Owen's survey exhibit and asked whether anyone had provided the permitting office with Harold's refusal letter when the application was submitted. Camille said she did not remember every document handled by consultants. The representative wrote that down. Then came the receipts. Naomi had copies of membership payment records provided by Peter and Allison, along with sales materials showing that buyers were paying substantial sums for reserved slips tied to guaranteed pedestrian shoreline access. Peter's receipt showed $26,000 paid for slip 41, and his agreement used the word guaranteed, without saying that Boone access remained disputed or still needed to be acquired. Other owners began checking their own contracts. The promise was everywhere. Naomi then produced my certified cease and desist and the delivery record showing Cedar Glass had received it before the opening, which established that the association had been formally told I did not consent to people crossing Boone Landing or placing a gangway there. After that came the earlier warning from Association Council stating that recorded upland access had not been located and recommending that guaranteed access not be advertised until the Boone issue was resolved. Camille stopped looking at me. She looked at her attorney. Naomi placed the Marina consultant's email beside it, the one warning that without lawful Boone access the slips would be waterborne improvements without a lawful pedestrian connection from Cedar Glass. 2 warnings. Then Naomi brought out Camille's own email. She read only the part that mattered, where Camille wrote that once memberships were committed, I would face dozens of homeowners expecting access instead of one board asking for it. Peter stepped forward and asked to see the page himself. Naomi handed it to him. He read it slowly, passed it to Allison, and then looked directly at Camille. You knew there was a problem before you took our money. Camille answered that she believed the access dispute could be resolved, and that her email described negotiation strategy, not an attempt to mislead anyone. Peter held up his contract. Then why does this say guaranteed? No answer came quickly enough. The compliance representative gathered the deed, survey exhibit, permit description, correspondence, and sales documents into the order she wanted for her review, then stated that the evidence presented did not support treating the Boone Shoreline route as an established HOA access corridor. She also confirmed that the gangway location shown by Owen's survey conflicted with the access representation under which the marina was supposed to begin member operations. The opening could not proceed through that route. That was the reversal. Camille had arrived with 64 buyers because she believed their money and expectations would make my boundary negotiable, but every contract in their hands now showed how much they had relied on a promise she could not document. Her brochure had become evidence. Her permit language had become a question, and her own email had explained why the buyers were there. Nothing dramatic had to happen. Owen rolled up his survey after the representative finished reviewing it. Naomi returned the deed copies to her case, and Peter stood beside Allison with their slip 41 folder pressed against his chest. Camille remained near the untouched ribbon while the photographer quietly lowered his camera. I had not won because I owned the lake, because I did not. I had not won because a surveyor could magically erase somebody else's rights, because he could not. The truth was much narrower and much stronger. Cedar Glass had promised 64 people a path across land where the records presented that morning showed no executed access right, and the gangway they planned to use sat inside my parcel. Camille had spent months trying to make that distinction disappear. The documents put it back. The Marina stayed closed after opening day, but the real cleanup took weeks, because stopping a ribbon cutting was much easier than untangling 64 contracts, reserve fund payments, vendor bills, and families who had planned their summers around those slips. Cedar Glass turned the matter over to its attorney and insurance carrier, while the board began reviewing how the project had been approved and how the access promises had been presented to buyers. Naomi reminded me that the goal was not to punish every person connected to the association. It was to restore my property rights and make the buyers whole as fairly as the process allowed. That mattered. Peter and Allison were among the first slip holders to receive formal instructions about unwinding their membership, and over the following weeks the association arranged for the affected Marina agreements to be rescinded or refunded as the access problem was addressed. Their $26,000 came back, and Peter called me the afternoon the funds cleared because he wanted me to know they had canceled the boat purchase before the remaining balance was due. He sounded relieved more than angry, which I understood after watching him spend weeks wondering whether his family's savings had disappeared into a dock he could not reach. They got out clean. The floating marina itself was not destroyed, because there was no reason to turn an access dispute into waste for the sake of revenge, and parts of the system could still have value if Cedar Glass later found a lawful connection to the lake. The gangway was removed from Boone Landing, however, and the marina sections were moved toward a staging cove while the association reviewed its options. Owen returned once more to make sure the relevant boundary markers were clear and properly documented, so nobody could later claim the location had been vague. The line stayed put. Cedar Glass also opened an internal financial review covering reserve funds, pre-sale money, consultant costs, and the decisions that allowed a marina project to move so far forward before lawful pedestrian access had been secured. Residents requested a special meeting, and this time the questions were not about lake views or property values. They wanted dates, approvals, contracts, and an explanation for why council's warning had not stopped the word guaranteed from appearing in sales materials. Camille attended, but the confidence I had seen at our first Shoreline meeting was gone. Paperwork does that. The board suspended her from the president's role while the review continued, and residents later voted to remove her from leadership. I did not attend to celebrate, because by then I had already gotten what I wanted. Boone Landing was no longer being treated as an access corridor, the gangway was gone, and the people who had bought memberships were being dealt with through the proper process instead of being sent to my gate to demand something I had never sold. That was enough. A few months later, members of the new board asked Naomi whether I would ever consider discussing another access route, one that would not use the disputed location and would be negotiated before anybody sold a single dock membership. I told her they were welcome to bring me a real proposal with a survey, a clear route, terms, compensation, insurance details, maintenance responsibilities, and whatever other documents their professionals believed were necessary. I promised nothing beyond listening. That was the point. A proposal is not ownership, a plan is not an easement, and wanting access badly enough does not create it. But neighbors can still negotiate when everybody starts with the truth. I was never against Cedar Glass using the lake. I was against Cedar Glass using my land without a right to do it. Peter and Allison stopped by Boone Landing later that summer with coffee, and we sat near the old dock, while their grandchildren skipped stones from a spot I had invited them to use for the afternoon. Peter laughed and told me he had learned more about easements in 2 months than he had wanted to learn in his entire life. I told him most people do. Then he asked whether I still kept all of Dad's old records, and I pointed toward the house. Every page. Dad would have liked that answer. That fall, I replaced several worn boards on the dock and sealed the wood before winter, working slowly on the same structure Harold had maintained and Elaine had loved. One evening I carried coffee down there as the sun dropped over Blue Heron Lake, and without thinking I took 2 mugs from the kitchen before noticing what I had done. I stood there for a second, put one back, and carried mine to the end of the dock. Some habits outlive people. The lake looked exactly as it had before Camille arrived, but I understood the property differently now, because nearly losing control of one narrow strip had reminded me why Dad had saved every deed, letter, permit, and survey instead of trusting somebody's memory of what was supposed to happen. He never believed paperwork made a person powerful. He believed it kept the truth from becoming a contest of personalities. There is a difference. I have told this story as a dramatized narrative, shaped the way memory and storytelling shape any complicated dispute, but the lesson I carried away from it is ordinary enough to use in real life. Know what your documents actually say, save important correspondence, ask questions before money changes hands, and get qualified help when a boundary or property right becomes uncertain. Laws and procedures can differ from one place to another, so the smart move is not copying what somebody in a story did. It is slowing down long enough to learn what applies to your own situation. Anger feels fast, but evidence lasts. When I think about Camille now, I do not remember the ribbon or the Marina brochure first. I remember Dad's metal box and that simple difference he taught me when I was young. Somebody can print a dotted line anywhere they want, but if that line crosses another person's property, sooner or later somebody has to show the right that put it there.